Welcoming home semester, because we already had here, so Scott was also here as a visiting assistant professor in 2011-2012. So I think you had a chance to attend a larger group then. And we're very happy to have Scott here because the work he does, I think, is particularly interesting for this group because he has, coming from Santa Cruz, having taken his dissertation of the direction of non-factors, he has this very strong background in formal theories of semantics and pragmatics, all sorts of things regarding clause types, evidentials, information structure, things like that. But then he has taken it to a strong fieldwork component, and if you look at his CV, he has done a lot of work on Yucatan Maya, on Tagalog, the paper we just looked at the mini group, and also on an endangered language or a smaller language in, not endangered, we talked about it, but it's a small language, an indigenous language in Ecuador, Ainge. So I think for us, looking at phenomena in these languages with the skills and the detail and the attention to detail we are familiar with from theoretical linguistics and formal semantics and pragmatics is extremely interesting. So if we have all these theories now, it's interesting to see what natural languages really do with it. In that sense, we're very grateful to have you here, and we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, thank you all for coming. It's exciting to be back in the Yukon Logic group after all these years away. And thanks to Magda in particular for organizing things and liaising. Great. Yeah, so I should say, feel free to stop at any point in time, especially with clarificatory questions, like, in talking about data from an understudied language that many of you all know nothing about. I'm sure there's, technical terms that I will inadvertently use that might require clarifying. So please feel free to jump in with that kind of thing, especially. All right, so in a recent manuscript and I think a Yukon Logic Group talk, as I understand it from last year, Emma Meyer and Torian Berry argue that natural language has two different ways that reported speech is realized. So two different mechanisms for reported speech, one which they call eventive, which involves asserting the existence of a prior speech event, and then attributing certain properties to it, right? So specifying the speaker of that event, the adversary, in the case of direct quotation, the form of that event, in the case of indirect speech, the content of that event, etc. So that's the eventive mode there. And then they also say that there's this additional mode that they call evidential, and they describe as expressing a not-at-issue reportative meaning component to provide evidence for the main proposition expressed. This definition is a little insufficiently general because it's specific to declarative sentences, and as we'll see, evidentials can and do occur across different sentence types, like imperatives and interrogatives, so we'll come back to that. But the basic idea is that this evidential mode is a way of affixing a little doodad to a proposition that I'm expressing, or to some content that I'm proffering in one way or another, that says to you where it comes from, but doesn't make that the main point of what's going on. It's sort of a little side note of, oh, by the way, let me flag this as having come from someone else in this way. And so along with this distinction, they make the claim that direct quotation occurs only in this eventive mode, sort of formally as an event modifier. So it says, the form of this event was blah, blah, blah. And that's the way the direct quotation works, and they try and analyze all direct quotation as working in that way. And so they arrive at this typology in one here of the kinds of reported speech, means of conveying reported speech that we have in language. So we have for indirect, we have these two modes. For direct, we just have this one mode, and then they have this unified account of those two at-issue or eventive modes there. And so in this talk, what I want to do is examine quotative particles in Mayan languages. We see an example here in 2, and I want to argue that they sort of falsify this typology in the sense that they involve direct speech in kind of every relevant sense, but that they nonetheless make a conventionalized at-issueness distinction of the same sort that reportatives do. So an example here is in 2. So we have le peco tu hanta pastel ki. The dog ate birthday cake, he says, right? So some individual unspecified here within this sentence says the dog ate birthday cake, quote. And so the take home that I want to establish is that just as they argue that there's these two different mechanisms for indirect speech, so too for direct speech we need two different mechanisms. One that I'm going to talk about here for today, for these kinds of quotatives, and I'll speculate a bit about other constructions in English and elsewhere that might instantiate this pattern at the end. And then the other one that is more like what they describe for ordinary verbs of saying. Okay. So the proposed typology that I want to arrive at is in 3 here. It says there's ad issueness, there's indirect speech, and in principle those things can cross-categorize so we can get each of those different combinations there. And then having done that, I want to spell out the sort of new corner of that table there, these quotatives, and specify what they are doing within a formal discourse model, and in particular within a sort of Farkas-Bruce style scoreboard semantics. I understand Donko was here recently, so maybe some of you all were at that talk and are familiar with that general framework. But a particular kind of dynamic and pragmatic account of that, and then we can sort of compare what quotatives do within that to what importatives do. So for the roadmap here, I'm going to introduce these two kinds of morphemes in my languages, reportatives and quotatives, or rep and quote, I'll just call them. I'll examine rep in more detail, looking at their ad issueness and what the properties are that establish that they do indeed have this conventional ad issueness distinction. Then I'll turn to look at quote in more detail, these quotative particles, and then provide the formal account and conclude. Okay. So in addition to various verbs of saying and various kinds of constructions, most Mayan languages, or at least all of the ones outside of the Eastern branch, have these two other prominent reported speech devices. So in 4 is some examples from languages that I have not studied personally, which is choti. So we have this reportative particle, i.e., right, that adds that they say to what otherwise looks like a matrix sentence. There's a meeting tomorrow. And then in 4b, we have this quotative that adds the he said to this content, there is a lot of work. So as you see in the table at the top of page 3, more or less every Mayan language outside of that Eastern branch where things are less clear has one of these particles there for reportative, and then has a similar quotative. We can also see that the quotatives are all cognate with one another. They all come from some common ancestor word that's gone various phonological changes. The reportatives are a bit more motley, and we'll see that they are a bit more motley in some other ways later as well. For the most part, I'll be focusing on data that I've elicited from Yucatec Maya, which has the reportative particle bean and the quotative ki, though occasionally I'll have cause to mention other languages. Okay. So I should say that despite the fact that I'm identifying these different particles here, a lot of the previous descriptive work on these languages doesn't really make a clear distinction between these two things, and sort of talks about them both as being hearsay markers or things like that. And so despite that, so I'm going to show a lot of very clear, I think, and very substantive differences between them. So I want to say a little bit about why people have not been so good at distinguishing them despite this. So one, they've kind of compared sentences that have one of these elements with sentences that have no reported speech at all, and said these are both ways of distancing the speaker from what's going on, right? And sort of focusing on what I would regard as a shared perlocutionary effect, distancing the speaker from this. And then 2, which I won't really touch in this talk today, both of these elements have a lot of different kinds of concord uses. So cases where you have both a verb of saying and a reportative, but it's a second-hand event. It's just the same meaning, give or take, as John said, blah, blah, blah. It's not they say that, John said that, blah, blah, blah. And the same is true for the quotative particle, and you can find uses that have all 3 of them. You can find uses that have quotative and reportative, various kinds of combinations like that that serve to sort of further blur the lines between these here. So I'm happy to answer questions about those, but that's kind of another talk for another day to think about these concord uses of these here. Okay, So I would say a little bit about just sort of getting the basics of these things and what they're like so that you can see them a bit here. So the reportatives in my languages, in most of the languages, they are second position clitics. We see that in 7, so they come after the first word there. And you can take they're more flexible, so we see this in 8, top of page 4. So if Carmen didn't pass the exam, and we could have the reportative in any of those different positions there. So it's kind of at any prosodic word break, any spot where there's a pause. As long as you're not breaking up a really close-knit constituent, you can toss in one of these reportatives in that place. They tend to go second position, but they can go in any of those places. Decordatives, on the other hand, are prosodically parenthetical, not integrated into the prosodic structure, so there's kind of always a big pause before them and always a big pause after them in cases where they're not final. So you see that sort of that contrast between 9, which has the reportative, where there's just kind of one phrase and it's somewhere tossed in the middle, versus in 10 and 11. So in 10 is the case where the quotative comes finally, which is very common, and there's a big pause before it. It's a separate intonational phrase. And then in 11, as in the English gloss here, we get that guy, Margarita told me, ate panuchos. Right? And so there's this pause sort of before and after the quotative and the other stuff which goes with it, which I'll talk about in a moment. Reportatives can be repeated within a clause, which doesn't have any specific deterministic effect, but seems to serve to sort of highlight the secondhand nature of the information to make sure you get the point that this potentially controversial thing I'm saying is coming from someone else. So 12 is sort of a particularly over-the-top example of that from a narrative text. So it's this guy talking about his son who's lazy and doesn't like to go work out in the fields like a good mind person should. And so he's saying, Kapatak bin, ichna bin, hach bin, ta choko kin bin. Because he says reportative, the son reportative, is reportative, very hot reportative. So this is not the typical state of affairs, but it's a possible thing to do that one does find people doing. Even in the languages where there are second position clitics, as in 12b here, from Tojo de Bal, from Alejandro Curiel's work, they can occur multiple times when you get multi-clausal structures or when you get topics and different things that create multiple second positions. In contrast to quotatives, you only get one quotative, you never repeat them in this way multiple times in an utterance. Okay, so that's a little bit on their form. In section 2.2, you talk a little bit about the syntax and semantics of the original speaker. So reportatives cross-linguistically are often regarded as markers of hearsay, and which I would interpret as meaning something like secondhand information of an unspecified provenance. And these reportatives in my languages, and I think in general, all work in that kind of situation. So 14 is an example of that. So we're talking about what rumors have you heard about your town? And then the speaker says, there's ghosts in Espita, this town. There's ghosts there, they say. Right? So he doesn't specify who is saying this. It's not clear in the context. This is fine. But reportatives are also at least as common in situations where the original speaker's identity is extremely clear in context, often to the point of being essentially anaphoric. So that's seen in 15 here. So I'm talking with you, my friend Alfredo calls on the phone. We know that Alfredo's on the phone. You're clearly like waiting for me to tell you what Alfredo says, and then I say, the dog ate the birthday cake, he says. Right, so I'm using the quotative as the only indication of reported speech here. It's very clear that it really can't be anyone other than Alfredo, the guy on the phone, who said this, and this is fine here. So these can have a determined reference that's specific, salient in the context already. They just need not. So they can have these sort of hearsay uses where it's an indefinite or generic they say kind of thing, but that's not a thing that they have to do. Despite this, though, reportatives don't have any kind of overt expression of the original speaker or speakers. So 16, I won't go through the examples, is a bunch of different attempts to formally realize either as an argument or via verbal agreement or some other way the identity of the speaker, and none of those things work with the reportative. In contrast, the quotative, most typically occurs quoting a single third-person speaker, and so it tends to look like a particle sometimes and be regarded as such sometimes. But we know that, at least in Yucatec Maya, and I'm pretty sure in all of these other languages, there's actually a paradigm here. It's sort of a defective verb of sorts that inflects in ways that are unlike normal verbs, unlike other verbs of saying, but that has these I said, you said, he said, she said, we said kinds of forms here. So since the third-person singular marker of this agreement marker set is null, this creates the appearance in examples like 18 that these are both, this is a particle in the same way that the reportative is, not inflecting for person at all. But even here we can see that the form with the quotative, that is 18a, only works in these cases where there's a salient specific reporter there, just like any other anaphoric pronoun or agreement would work. Whereas in 18b, with the reportative, this works both in that case where there is a salient original speaker and in any other case where there isn't, with this generic they say kind of case. Okay. And then finally, the third and perhaps most fundamental distinction between these two, as noted at the beginning, is that quotative particles, as the name suggests, are verbatim quotes using the words of the original speaker, whereas reportatives are using the contents of the original speaker. We can see this in a variety of different ways. So first and second person pronouns are the most obvious one, perhaps. Other indexical expressions, discourse particles, other things like that, all are used with quotatives as though they are from the perspective of the original speaker, all with reportatives as though they are from the perspective of the actual speaker uttering the sentence. So we can see this in the pair in 19 and 18. So 19 is kind of imagine an original setting in which Maria says, oh, I need to finish studying, right? So she sees clouds and says, I need to go home now, I need to stop. And so she says, oh, I need to stop. So of course she's talking about herself and what she needs. She's talking about her own surprise, so she uses this mirative particle to indicate her surprise, bakan. She uses the first person because she's talking about herself, all quite normal. If I then want to go tell you about this later on, I can do this with either the reportative or with this quotative. If I do it with the reportative, all the pronouns are now third person because they're from my perspective. Maria is not me, is a third person, so I use that. These speaker-oriented particles, like the mirative particle that indicate that her surprise originally, is no longer applicable because I am not surprised telling you this story later on in the day. Rather, she was surprised in the first place. In contrast with the quotative here in 20b, right, this is me repeating the words that she said, and so I can say, oh, I need to finish studying, she told me. Right, so just like in the English case there, I use the first person pronoun, I can still use the discourse particles that are from her perspective, etc. So kind of everything shifts here, just as in any other case of direct quotation. We can see similarly that substitution of co-referring expressions is possible with reportatives, but not with quotatives. So in 21, we have a mother saying, my son is afraid the dog will bite him. Right, and then in 22, we see that with the reportative, I can then say, the boy is afraid that the dog will bite him, right, using a different lexical expression, the boy, that in context can refer to that same individual. But with the quotative, I can't do that, right? Maria, or the mother didn't say the boy, the mother said my son, and so I can't quote her as saying the boy is afraid because she said my son is afraid. Right? And so substituting in this co-referential expression here tends not to work in this quotative case in B, but it's fine in A. Okay. So a brief summary of these properties, which are sort of backed up in more detail in a recent paper that I just wrote that's sort of more descriptively oriented, is found in this table here. I haven't talked about the B properties that are a little grayed out there yet, but we'll get to sort of the illocutionary potential and different sentence types in a moment. But that's sort of the introduction to these particles. So now I want to turn to talk in more detail about the reportatives and the ad-issue-ness that they encode, and then we'll sort of double back to the quotatives here. Okay. So reportatives, So reportatives convey the content of the sentence in which they appear, has as its source a prior speech event. I'll use the term scope proposition to refer to the content of that prior speech event, and reportative proposition to refer to the fact that there was such a speech event, and sort of represent them just a P, a rep P, in what follows. So comparing reportatives with lexical verbs of saying, then the primary conventionalized difference is this additionist difference. So with reportatives, the reportative proposition is not at issue, is not the main point of the conversational contribution you make when you utter one, whereas the scope proposition is. With verbs of saying, the reportative proposition is sort of semantically, I would say, at issue. The scope proposition is not semantically at issue, but we have sort of pragmatic reasoning, as various people have argued, in particular Mandy Simons, that allows us to use that complement clause as though it were the main point pragmatically, right? So that's possible to do in that case there, but it's not part of the semantics of that thing there. So there's a couple different arguments for this conclusion that we can give, and so I want to run through them in a bit of detail here for the reportative, and then we'll come back and see the sort of the same kinds of arguments for the quotatives in a moment. So the first argument is that reportative sentences are felicitous in response to questions under discussion about the scope proposition, but not the reportative proposition. This is a little hard to establish in a fieldwork setting because, if I say, "What did you hear?" it's fairly normal to say, "John's coming," right? As a response to that, so using an overt question-answer pair is actually not a very good way to investigate this, which is kind of the most typical way that we investigate this theoretical notion of question under discussion. But we've tried to engineer scenarios where the sort of point of the discourse is to figure out about who said what, or the point of the discourse is to figure out the fact of the matter about the scope here. So in 23A, we have a context where you're a detective trying to figure out who stole the cow, right? So you don't care who said what about anything, you just want to know the facts of the matter. And so this sentence with reportative is fine in that context. So it was Jose who stole the cow, they say, right? So the fact that Jose stole the cow, or the supposition that he stole the cow, is the sort of main point there, resolves our question in the conversation. In contrast, in B, we have a QED where I already know who stole what animals. I'm trying to figure out how gossip spreads, and so I just want to know who knows what about this, or who said what about this to who. And so in that kind of case, even though 23 seems to have exactly the right kind of information, that they say that Jose stole the cow, or someone says that Jose stole the cow, the sentence is not the way to do this here. Instead, you would use a lexical verb of saying in this kind of case, precisely because that's the main point, and lexical verbs of saying allow for that. Okay, so that's first argument from QEDs. Second argument is the ways that speakers can react to these utterances in context here. So these unmarked responses, things analogous to English yes and no, although mine doesn't really have things like yes and no exactly, but whatever the unmarked responses are, target the scope proposition rather than the reportative proposition. So if I say Oscar is very bad, and you say no, that's not true, right? That can really only be interpreted as meaning he's not bad, rather than no one said that or he didn't say that. Right, the same is true kind of even more clearly for the positive responses, but equally true for the negative responses, right? So the main point here that I am addressing your question with and expecting that you might go on to debate with me and talk further about is about the fact of the matter in this case of whether Oscar is bad, and not about who says what at all. Okay. And then the third argument finally is that the scope proposition here, the scope material is obligatory. It's realized with a normal matrix utterance, as we see here in 25. Right, so I just started the sprinkle reportative, that's fine, but just using the reportative on its own, right, something like he says that, right, this kind of thing is fine with a verb of saying, right, he said that, he said it, something like that, where you have this pronominally interpreted, unexpressed direct object there. But with the reportative, this is quite bad. In case you're wondering, when I get a Tagalog, I think you can get things like 25B, and so that's kind of a point of potential cross-linguistic difference. But in Mayan, as far as I can tell, you simply can't get those kinds of things. Okay, so that's sort of the ad-issueness side of the coin. The other aspect of illocutionary potential that I want to talk about with reportatives here is what happens outside of declarative sentences. And so this, I think, is one particular way that reportative utterances in Mayan languages are matrix-like in their effects as in these non-declarative sentence types. So cross-linguistically, there seems to be an implicational hierarchy of sorts, that if a language has reportatives and imperatives, it also has them in interrogatives and declaratives. If you have them in interrogatives, you also have them in declaratives. But as far as I know, you don't find languages that have them in imperatives and declaratives, but not interrogatives, say, or just in imperatives. Within Mayan, there are some languages that disallow them outside of declaratives, but in most languages, they're fine in all three of these sentence types. So I talk a little bit about what happens in these different sentence types. I guess those of you who are in the meeting group sort of just heard about the imperative case already, so apologies for doubling up on that. But okay, for interrogatives, so interrogatives with reportatives are known to give rise to some amount of variation across languages. Obviously, we just heard that they don't work in some languages, so that's one form of variation. Even when they do work, there's at least two different kinds of readings that are widely attested cross-linguistically. So first we have what's been called the interrogative flip reading. So this is a reading in which the reportative meaning is applied to the expected answer of the addressee. So Sarah Murray has talked about this a lot in her dissertation/book, and in some other work as well. So that is to say, I expect you to answer based on reportative evidence, but nothing is reported from my perspective. So sort of the origin of the reportative requirement flipped, so to speak, to the addressee. We'll see examples in a moment. And then the other reading that's widely attested is this interrogative by proxy, as I'll call it. So that is, the reportative meaning is applied to the question itself, in effect kind of passing along someone else's question to the addressee. Right, so I'll note that both of these readings involve actual illocutionary questions. Upon uttering one with either of these meanings, the addressee is expected to answer the question in some way. It might differ as to whether it's expected to be reportative specifically or not, but in either case, you're expected to respond, and it really is sort of a normal garden variety question here. Okay, so as we see in 27, so this is an example from Tagalog. The reportative in Tagalog is possible in either of these two scenarios. Right, so we have one sentence, sino daw yung kumanta, and this is fine in the by proxy context. So this is, you went to a concert, my roommate wants to know about it and asked me to ask you, and so I say, who is the singer? Reportative, right? So passing along my roommate's question, asking it of you, knowing that you will answer based upon your firsthand experience of having been to the concert. In Tagalog, this also works in the flip context. So the flip context, I have your roommate went to a concert, and I know this, I know you didn't go. I asked you about the concert, expecting that you're going to respond based upon what your roommate said. And so the Tagalog example works equally fine in that context, right? Where it's clear in the context that I expect that you will respond based on what your roommate told you, therefore what you heard secondhand, but I'm sort of asking the question of my own accord. So that's the flip context. In Mayan languages, however, as far as I can tell, and certainly in Yucatec Maya, it seems very clear that the reportative works in the by proxy context, but not in the flip context. So it works in the case where I'm passing along someone else's question, but it simply does not work in the other flip case. This is kind of interesting, since a lot of people have assumed that there was sort of a hierarchy here as well, that you found languages where it had the flip reading but not the by proxy. And this is the reverse case, which, as far as I know, hasn't been really demonstrated previously, but it's quite clear here, I think. Okay, so that's the interrogatives, imperatives. Imperatives, kind of similar to the by proxy reading here, have this sort of by proxy interpretation. passing along some kind of imperative meaning from some third party. And what I show in this 2017 paper, and want to belabor the point here since some of you all just were talking about this paper, is that they serve the same range of illocutionary functions as other imperatives. So imperatives we think of as being about commands, but as a number of people, including Magda, have talked about, right, they can do lots of different things, from wishes, advice, offers, permissions, commands. With the reportative here, they can continue to do all of those different things, and indirectly the reportative may play a role in that sort of pragmatic reasoning process of what specific speech act do we get on a given occasion, but it doesn't in principle rule any of them out. Okay, so that's reportatives and their sort of illocutionary potential and / ad issueness. And so now I want to turn to look at these quotatives and comparing them with what we've just seen for the reportatives. And so, again, the basic finding that I want to show is that these quotatives have a similar kind of ad issueness contribution to what we've just seen, but they have this different interaction with different sentence types, as we'll see. Okay. So these are sort of the same three arguments we just saw for reportatives, but here for quotatives. So the first argument here is that quotative sentences are felicitous in response to, well, quoted QEDs about the scope, but not about the fact of the quote itself, right? So again, if you want to just talk about who said what, or what did Luis say in this case, using this, there's ghosts in his pizza, Luis tells me, is a bad way to respond to that kind of question. If we're responding to a sort of quoted question within this universe, so like, what, are there ghosts in his pizza, he asks, right, something like that, then this is a fine way to respond to that question about the scope. But it's a bad way to respond to what question about who said what, or whether Luis said, quote, there's ghosts in his pizza, or who said there's ghosts in his pizza. Any of those kinds of cases, this is quite odd. And again, a lexical verb of saying is the way to do that in that case. Second, these unmarked responses like yes and no don't target the fact of the report itself, right? And so therefore are bad as we see in 31b here. So he goes, he says, Bobby wants the meat to fall, right? If I respond with yeah or no, that's simply odd here. It doesn't mean, yeah, he said that, no he didn't, right? As you might expect that it could, it simply is weird. Okay. So the actual addressee can't respond using these normal ways of responding analogous to yes and no, and in fact very rarely responds in any way. So these are primarily used in narrating a story, and there's two characters talking back and forth, and so you're saying, so he says blah blah blah, and he says blah blah blah, and he says blah blah blah. Going back and forth is where you find these here, and so the addressee sort of responding in any way is fairly odd, and in particular responding with these unmarked ways is quite impossible. Okay, and then finally in 32 here we see that again the scope material, here sort of the words themselves rather than the content, is obligatory and can't be left out, which again stands in contrast with lexical verbs of saying. Right? So you could talk about some quoted material and then say, yep, he said that, he said it, and that's fine with the lexical verb of saying. It's out with these quotatives, as in 32b here. Right? So with 32b with an overt lexical verb of saying is fine. They say it, they said it to him, but is bad with these here. Okay. Okay, so 33 is an example of that, actually, with the lexical verb of saying. So we have this lexical verb of saying, ya'lik, and then we have this null pronominal argument here for what was said, and this is perfectly fine in this case here. Okay. So quotatives conventionally mark the speech report itself as not an issue in a way similar to what reportatives do. And then I briefly turn to see what happens outside of declarative sentences, where I think, again, the contrast between them is even more stark. So basically, whereas with reportatives, we've seen that whatever illocutionary force is associated with the sentence type of the material that goes with the reportative, those effects are sort of felt in the actual discourse with reportatives. With quotatives, this really is never the case within the sort of real conversation that we're engaged in. So regardless of the person features of the original speaker and addressee, if I do an interrogative with that, no one is actually going to respond to me in the way that they would normally if I ask you a question, right? Similarly for an imperative, if I say, close the door, he says, right? Or close the door, I say, no matter, or I say to you, no matter how you fix those arguments there, this is not at all in any way, shape, or form a way of actually commanding someone to do something. So you see these lined up here in 35 and 36 for the interrogative imperative. So 35 is a pair of sentences from a dialogue. So it's, son, I said to him, how many dry plantings did you do? Us, he said, almost 20 units of land. Right? So you see that the actual addressee doesn't respond, but instead, another character within the story, or another agent within the narrative, because these need not be fictional, responds using the normal ways that you would respond to a question, just within the universe of the story. Similarly for the declarative in 34 here, so while it's weird for the addressee to say yes or no, right, it's totally normal for one and the same speaker to say, well, so he goes, Bobby wants the meat to fall. And I'm like, yeah, right, responding within that quoted universe, in this case with the first person quote, saying, reenacting or demonstrating what kind of response was given there, right? And those responses work in exactly the same way that normal, ordinary matrix responses with no quotes in sight work. So we use these unmarked things like yes and no in the same way we would normally. And then finally in 36, we have the imperative, which similarly sort of demonstrates an imperative that's being quoted in this narrative context, but doesn't cause anyone in the actual discourse, like the addressee, to do something upon having heard this, doesn't allow them to use particles that they might use to respond to an imperative, but rather allows some other agent within the discourse to do that, or just allows them to act. And so 36 is a case from a text that's just the narrator of the story saying, so he was like, come in and learn the song we're making. She began to sing, right? So just sort of indicating that she does in fact just do the thing that the imperative is ordering or requesting that the person does in that case. Okay, so to summarize, I've argued that these quotatives have a mix of properties in common with direct reports, with verbs of speaking, verbs of speech, and with reportatives. And so the sort of summary of this typology of reported speech constructions that I propose is in 37 here. Right, so quotatives fill that fourth corner of this grid here that Barry and Meyer claim doesn't exist. Okay, so that's kind of the empirical side of this sort of theoretically guided empirical side, but through the empirical side. So now I want to give an analysis of what's happening with these reportatives and quotatives within a formal model of discourse here. So on the face of it, the idea that quoted material could be at issue is maybe a bit counterintuitive, because after all, we're just talking about the words that someone said, and so what does it mean for those words to be at issue is not entirely clear. And we'll note in particular that within these quotes, all of these different little discourse particles, different sentence types that do all these rich interactional things in normal discourse, do all of those things just within this narrative universe here. So the problem is pretty severe, and especially severe when we think of the ways in which quotation is often treated in the literature on quotation. So people who've studied quotation have often been concerned with how to integrate the quoted material into ordinary truth conditional semantic representations, and that's obviously going to be something that's quite necessary for different kinds of mixed quotation. Right? So if I say, Bill said to me that he was the best father of all time, right? Quoting the best father, clearly somehow those words have to, get squeezed into being semantic content, and is not, and so that's kind of been the focus there. But these cases here seem to suggest sort of the opposite is true here. And so when I sort of formalize a little bit how this might work within this model of discourse. Okay, so in 5.1, I'm going to sketch the sort of scoreboard model of discourse that I'm assuming. And so the sort of basic analogy of thinking about the state of a discourse as a scoreboard, I think goes back at least to David Lewis's work, where he sort of famously analogizes the state of a discourse to the scoreboard in a baseball game. It says we have this kind of mental scoreboard that we're keeping track of where we're at in the discourse. What things have we been talking about? What things do we know, think we know, etc. So Farkas and Bruce introduced a very influential specific such system in their 2010 paper, a sort of simplified version of which is seen in 38 here. So crucially, their model has both sort of individually anchored components, the individual discourse commitments, the DC of the individual agents in the conversation. For simplicity's sake, we'll just assume two speakers here interacting. And then it also has these shared components in the middle column here that are sort of things that we are mutually coordinating on the contents of and sort of idealizing away from uncertainty about what we each know. We think of there as being just sort of one shared such component. Okay, so the discourse commitments DC of a given agent X are the set of propositions P that the conversational participant X is publicly committed to believing and or having adequate evidence that they are true. Right, so these are things that I'm staking my reputation on this thing being true. Whereas the sort of shared resource in this domain is the common ground. And this is the common ground in exactly the classic Stalnackerian sense. The set of propositions Q that a given set of conversational participants, here A and B, is publicly committed to acting as though they believe to be true. Right, so these are the propositions that are guiding our joint action here. We're sort of, if we're planning what we're doing for the day, we're planning based on these things that we're taking for granted here in the common ground. Whereas the individual ones are sort of more directly about what we believe, what we think, what we know. Okay, and then finally I should say the table. The table is kind of the place where the action happens. So when I make a move in the discourse, I'm kind of putting it on the table for people to address. And so that's where the at-issue content goes, is the table here. Okay. So one of the key claims of this Farkas and Bruce paper is that the conventional effect of declarative sentences includes updates both to the individual discourse commitments of the speaker who utters it, and a proposal to update the common ground, that is putting the proposition P on the table, where it will come to be in the common ground should it be accepted by the addressee. Right? So for a declarative, acceptance can just be kind of nodding. It can be not really doing anything, right? You don't have to do something. You can use something like yes or yeah, or make some overt indication of like, I accept that. But you need not. And so that's the idea here. So I sort of indicate I have adequate evidence for P, put that into my individual discourse commitments, and then I propose that we move forward in discourse acting as though P is in fact the case. I won't go into too much detail for interrogative. I won't go into any detail for interrogatives and not too much for imperatives. But the basic idea is similar, that we want to take these moves as proposing to update shared scoreboard components. In the case of imperative and interrogatives, that would be the question under discussion stack. In the case of imperatives, this would be shared or common effective preferences. So it's preferences that are all consistent enough that we can act upon them, of the sort spelled out in Conderotti and Lauer here. I should say that this is one particular way of doing imperatives. It's drawing on things that are out there in other people's work in the literature. I'm sure there's lots of different ways of incorporating the imperatives here. The key thing really is just that imperatives involve proposing to update some shared scoreboard component. And so I think there's a variety of different ways you could go about doing that, and there's not anything particular to this way of doing it so long as it has that proposal to update a shared scoreboard component in common with assertions. Okay. All right. So for reportatives then, so the ideas of both reportatives and quotatives ensure that the reportative content is not an issue content, but they do this in very different ways. So within the scoreboard framework, at-issueness is reified as being put on the table. And so Farkas and Bruce, sort of their main at-issue content of their paper is analyzing these responses like yes and no and the way that they operate across declarative and interrogative sentences. In essence, analyzing them as making a particular kind of anaphoric reference to the table, right? Saying the proposition that's in the table is true, is false, etc. But they also explicitly assume that things put on the table have this requirement that they address the question under discussion, right? So this main point status is equated with being put on the table here. And so we'll note that in normal cases of plain old assertions like it's raining, right? The thing that goes on the individual discourse commitment matches the thing that's being put on the table here, and that's obviously a normal state of affairs to encounter. But the claim that I have made in a couple of recent papers and adopting here is that reportatives make a sort of asymmetric assertion of a particular kind. So a speaker who utters a declarative with a reportative does two different scoreboard updates when they do that. So first, they publicly commit not to P itself, but rather to having heard that P, right? To having reportative evidence for that scope proposition. Right? So I'm saying I'm staking my reputation on this, I'm vouching for the fact that I've heard that P, and on that basis, I think we ought to act as though P is the case. Right? So I sort of hedge my bets a little bit, allow myself to save face if it turns out that P is not true, because all I've told you, all I've committed to is that I've heard that P, but nonetheless I think it's likely enough that P, or at least I probably do given that I've made this move, that I'm trying to get us to act as though P is in fact the case. Okay, so we see a specific example in 41 here. It just started to sprinkle, he says, where P is being put onto the table, and I am publicly committing to having heard that P. So evidentials then are sort of a way of making a discourse move while being explicit and upfront, sort of disclosing the epistemic and for imperatives teleological basis for the move. And so for declaratives, this might kind of arise, might lead to different outcomes depending on the authority of the original speaker. So if it's sort of original speaker that doesn't really know what they're talking about, or whose opinion we don't care about, or it's not really specified, then this might sort of be a way of weakening my claim, hedging it in a certain way. But we can also find cases where the reportative gives a way of sort of using an appeal to authority kind of argument, where I say, John says blah, 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 and where if John is an authority on the topic at hand here, then that might be a very good way to strengthen the force of my assertion. So it doesn't indicate that I don't think it, it just indicates this other person who's more important in this context also thinks it, and therefore you really ought to accept it. Okay. Imperatives kind of make a similar sort of divide, so they indicate that I have heard that we ought to have this preference, right? Or someone else thinks we ought to have this preference. And so make an individual commitment to having heard that, and then nonetheless still make this move of putting the thing on the table. So in this 2017 paper that the meeting group was just looking at, I should kind of talk through some of the pragmatic reasoning that gets you from that elocutionary update to these specific effects that it might have of either strengthening the imperative force, making it a stronger command, like you better do this because mom tells me to tell you to do this, sibling, or making it kind of weaker, like, well, they say you should do this, but I'm, maybe not, personally on the hook for that there. Okay, so that's reportatives in this kind of scoreboard model. So we'll note that they put P or the preference for P or the question of whether P on the table, and then they have this reportative evidence in the individual discourse commitments separate from So what about quotatives? Well, so the intuition with quotatives is that the scope material with them interacts with the discourse scoreboard just like any matrix utterance would. It just does so within the universe of the narrative itself. And so the proposal then is that what we need is sort of proliferation of these scoreboards, ad hoc scoreboards that are kind of created on an as-needed basis in telling a story, right? So the idea is that narrating a story is sort of creating this new reality. When I have these characters having dialogue within a narrative, I'm creating this new narrative context, and I'm just populating that with information. I'm not actually directly doing anything to enrich our actual common ground in our conversation here, and anything like that happens sort of very indirectly. So this is just a way of me saying, let's put ourselves in this narrative context, and then I'm going to, act as though we're there and tell the story of what people said there, kind of demonstrating or reenacting what things they did there. So we see a specific example worked out here in 43. This is a bit of an involved context. So we have this guy, Venustiano, who is telling a true story to a researcher, Cesar. And so this story that he's telling has two characters in it. Don Miro, who's this 100-year-old man. Don Miro is talking to his children, including his son Salvador. So we have Don Miro talking to Salvador in the story that Venustiano is telling to Cesar. So Don Miro and Salvador are kind of talking back and forth, and then Don Miro says, children, I wasn't a slave, he said. Right, so we have this vocative here, children, we have the first person pronoun, I. All of those things are from the perspective of Don Miro, this character in the story. And then we have the key at the end, that he said, which is Venustiano's comment on Don Miro saying this thing. Right, so in the actual scoreboard, we don't have anything being put on the table here. There's no actual move being made. We kind of get this discourse commitment that Venustiano in telling this story has that Don Miro said this. Even that probably is sort of an indirect effect, I would think, but I don't have any specific to that. But then within this narrative scoreboard here with Don Miro and Salvador interacting here, we get an ordinary assertion that P, an ordinary assertion, I wasn't a slave, or Don Miro isn't a slave, being uttered in this context here, behaving just like the matrix utterance that Don Miro would have originally said here, I was not a slave, would behave. Right, so all of the different kinds of response particles, illocutionary potential of those quoted things, all happen in the normal way within this narrative scoreboard here. The actual scoreboard is very minimally affected, if at all, by just the fact of this thing having been said here, being realized in this way. So the quotative particle then sort of hardwires into its meaning these two different functions. So first, it sort of fixes the elements of the context within the narrative scoreboard, right? So telling us where we're at in the scoreboard, who's speaking, who's the addressee, things like that. And then it also, provides this, maybe in theory redundant signal to the actual discourse participants saying this content that's happening here is being interpreted relative to one of these narrative scoreboards rather than to the actual scoreboard. Right, so the intuition is that this dialogue and narrative, whether it's a fictional or a real narrative, involves kind of displacing ourselves to some other point in time, space, perspectives, and then reenacting or demonstrating this conversation at that other set of coordinates here. But once we're at that location, at this other scoreboard here, things locally interact with one another in normal ways. So all these things like yes and no that we think involve this kind of scoreboard, the illocutionary forces of these different sentence types, all of those things play out in the normal way, just in this other scoreboard. So I should say this is work in progress. I think the sort of key questions that I'm leaving open here and that I'd love to hear any thoughts that you all have about have to do with sort of the ways in which content flows back and forth between these different scoreboards, between these different sets of worlds here. So some of these are sort of general things about how narrative works, about how fiction works, And then some of them are sort of more specific to this case of narrative dialogue that we're looking at here. So I list some of these out here, right? So as Cesar accepts Venustiano's assertions about the state of the world, he has to make inferences about which one of those are in the common ground that those agents in the story have. As the common ground is enriched from Del Nero and Salvador accepting one another's assertions, right? The speaker and hearer in the actual world, Venustiano and Cesar in this case, have to make inferences about which one of those things that they conclude are in fact true of the world of the evaluation of the narrative. Right? And then finally, we have to think about, well, is this a fictional narrative? Is this a true narrative? If it's a true narrative or intended to be true narrative, is it accurate, right? So as we gain knowledge about the world of evaluation of this sort of embedded in narrative context, what do we do with that information, right? If we're reenacting Harry Potter talking to Hermione, right, we're not going to really take anything directly from that as far as the facts of our actual world are concerned, right? In this case, we're talking about a putatively real story, and so in some way, shape, or form, we ought to be taking some, facts away from this, creation of this shadow context into account as actual facts of the real world, or at least that seems to be the intent here. So all this to say that the account that I have here so far sort of, I think, awaits, suitably fleshed out theories of narrative and of fiction in particular to interact with these things here and make kind of, clear, decisive predictions about what we ought to expect there. The key point for the present, though, is simply that the Mayan quotative seems to conventionally encode that we are in this sort of state of affairs, making moves or demonstrating moves that would have been made relative to these non-actual narrative scoreboards here. Okay, so I've argued in this talk empirically that these quotatives in non-Eastern Mayan languages combine the features of direct speech reports, that's verbatim quotation, with the conventional ad issueness distinction, very much like what we have in reportatives. And so we have this picture here in 44 where we have indirect speech, direct speech, cross-categorizing with ad issue and not ad issue content here. So beyond the issues you already discussed, I think one sort of pressing question that this raises is what sorts of cases this kind of analysis is applicable to. Right, so as I already sort of noted in passing, some kinds of quotation, like partial quotation or mixed quotation, contribute to the ordinary truth conditional content in the actual scoreboard, rather than doing one of these, shifting context kinds of things at all, and therefore presumably merit a different analysis, right? So, I use the word mixed in quotes here to indicate that some other scholar used the word mixed to refer to this kind of quotation here in this bullet point. But I don't think that we want to say that there is sort of a discourse move that consists of uttering the word mixed relative to some other shadow context there. We don't seem to be doing anything quite so radical here as far as shifting our context when we just quote a single word like that here. Right? So sort of where exactly the boundaries are is not clear, but I think it's clear that there's cases of both types. There's sort of gray areas where similar kinds of bicontextualism have been applied recently, for example, by Regina Eckhart in her book on free and direct discourse, uses a fairly similar kind of basic approach of creating these new contexts where context includes not just things like the speaker and hearer and the world of evaluation, but also these discourse components, in her case the common ground, here sort of generalize that notion to the whole richer scoreboard that we think we want for these things like yes and no and different illocutionary forces. So I don't have any particular stance on free and direct discourse and where it falls, but I think the point is that there's cases on both sides, and figuring out where that line is drawn of which things go which way is going to be a set of future research questions to hopefully engage in. On the other hand, we might also wonder conversely, sort of for languages that don't have these grammaticized quotative particles, right, which a number of languages do. They don't really get talked about nearly as much as reportatives, but a number of languages do have them. But for languages that don't, like say English, are there elements that make use of this kind of mechanism? In the case of reportatives, various authors, especially Sarah Murray most explicitly, I think, have suggested that these slifting constructions, so it's raining, John said, or it is, John said, but raining, those kinds of cases kind of conventionally indicate the ad issueness with that construction and conventionally indicate reported speech with the verb of saying, and so do that same kind of thing for reportatives. And so we might wonder, are there cases where English does this with quotatives? The most obvious case, I think, is the case like in 45A here, right? I'm leaving, he said, right? Where we, similarly to that case that we just saw with slifting, right? We use this parenthetical intonation with a lexical verb of saying. But here we have this direct quoted material. Obviously, this is more common in writing than in speech, but that would be one kind of candidate. In 45B, we have an interesting construction that I haven't seen any work on, but that strikes me as a non-native user of it as being very similar, which is this sort of invariant says. So I says to John, why don't we pretend we want to buy the pig? Right, where you use the form says regardless of person rather than conjugating it. And that seems very colloquial in spoken English for certain Englishes. It seems, as far as I can tell, to really only be used for this kind of reenacting or demonstrating narrative here and being direct verbatim quotation. But it seems hard to imagine someone saying, what did you say to John? I says to John, why don't we pretend we want to buy the pig? Right? That doesn't seem like how that's used, so that might be another kind of case. And there may well be others. So John Lucy has a paper on these where he sort of suggests that go and like in colloquial English are maybe similar to this as well. And so exactly how or whether this analysis applies to these different constructions is sort of another potential future area for someone who studies English more than I do. So thank you all.
This isn't really interesting. This isn't a theoretical question. In the end, the question about English, yeah, I was thinking about he's like and so forth. But as far as the reportatives go, what are the relevant differences between a genuine reportative and something like purportedly or allegedly in English? I mean, I can see that, for instance, that wouldn't seem to work in interrogatives and imperatives. But what other sort of syntactic or otherwise relevant for your work differences are there?
Yeah, I understand much less well how these more lexical means in English work to do this. Because they do have these sort of, all the different cases you just mentioned of purportedly, allegedly, reportedly, all have these subtle nuances to what they're conveying epistemically that I don't really understand and that are quite a bit different. I mean, I think one thing that's important to note about these reportatives is that you use them all the time. So like I might tell you a story that somebody else told me, but retell it in my own words and just use it every sentence of telling that story, right? Whereas in English, we would never say, reportedly, Bill left the party early. Reportedly, he got an Uber. Reportedly, he got home and then he threw up. Reportedly, he woke up and had a hangover the next morning. Like, that's not at all a normal way to do it, whereas that's totally, what you do with these in many languages much of the time, and definitely for Mayan, that's true. So I guess, I have the sense that maybe related to that fact, the English ones are a bit more upfront about having some kind of doubt or uncertainty to them. And I think cross-linguistically, there's sort of variation in reportatives and to what extent they have that. So like the German reportative use of sollen might be a bit more like that and less like this, or maybe somewhere in the middle. Whereas these markers here really don't, in and of themselves, have any doubt. They just kind of allow you to compute pragmatically, oh, this person should have just said this and they didn't, and so they must have some doubt and make those inferences on certain occasions. But it's not really part of their meaning, I guess. So I think that's maybe the main difference, but is that they're sort of more explicitly modal than at least this kind of reportative in these languages is, but I don't know. There are reasons I don't study English.
Can I ask one more thing?
Sure.
About the, again, reportatives, and so on page 9 of the handout, you had this note. You said when you were contrasting the interrogative flip and the interrogative by proxy. You said that both readings involve actual elocutionary questions. Was this in contrast to, say, things like whether the concert was good? Because at least I know one language where you could have a reportative together with something like that. Blank, whether the concert was good. I'm talking about Czech. And that would involve the by proxy reading.
I see.
But
yeah,
is that what you were?
No, that was not a reference to these weird Czech.
Not Czech, but the weather kind of thing.
No, I guess that was more just contrasting it with the quotative case where there's not really an actual question being levied against the addressee.
Oh, okay.
Or something that's more like, I wonder whether blah, 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 or I wonder who left, where you might imagine that these could be used, and where other evidential certainly do get used for these cases, where there's like an interrogative in form, but there isn't really a question being asked.
But in Czech I can say, pri, whether it's going to rain, indicating that I'm asking you sort of on behalf of somebody else asked the question. And with that, is there something like that in the Mayan languages?
No, there's nothing like that. I mean, I think in part that my memory is that Czech has this like insubordination thing where these things that look like embedded clauses get used in matrix cases to add some kind of expressive thing to it. And so I think there might be more going on in the Czech example that meets the eye too. This is what somebody who gave a talk in our department about Czech insubordination tried to show a couple weeks ago. So yes, I don't know what's happening in that case, but yeah, there's nothing analogous to that here where you use something that. So for WH questions, the embedded ones and the matrix ones are identical in Maya, so that doesn't help us.
Oh, okay.
The polar questions do look a little bit different, and there you can't just use the embedded looking one as a matrix utterance, whether or not there's this reportative there. Yeah.
I have a question. You said you don't talk about English, but I have to scratch you in English. So on page 8, you talk about the brevity can be, and you say that the reported proposition is an issue, and the scope proposition is not an issue, but can be readily be interpreted as an issue pragmatically. Now, I was wondering about this because, I mean, from what I remember from the assignments and later assignments in all literature, the construction itself, like A said, P, is kind of unmarked. And it's the discourse that tells you what is the question and the discussion, and that will determine what is interpreted as an issue, and it could be either the entire proposition or the embedded thing. That's just about the literature. But then there's a follow-up question to that in a way, because so one of the best analysis of verb second in German that I've seen says that is now a construction where you're not free to have the entire thing an issue, but you're really marking that the pre-Jason is an issue, like what you say, the full proposition. And I was interested in this because to my feeling, since you looked into imperatives, even the regular speech reports of imperatives that I've seen with a verb can be and an embedded imperative, they all have the property that the imperative has to be an issue, and it's not that the entire reporting construction is the issue. So the interesting thing is there, two things. On the one hand, there seem to be constructions that have verbally can be and have a marking that the embedded thing is an issue, just like you have for the reportative particles. And the other thing is that across languages, imperatives seem to be happy only in embeddings that have this property. I don't know what that is then, but it's interesting. So, and it fits the bill that they occur with reportative particles, like the Colloquium or whatever.
Yeah, so I guess on the first point about the Simon stuff, so I think you can take the Simon 2007 paper as maybe saying a couple different things. So like one way to take it is, as you say, that it's kind of underspecified what the at issue content is. The other way that like I think fits fits a bit more with some of Mandy's more recent thinking about sort of things like embedded implicatures say, is that it really, conventionally the declarative matrix sentence mood on the verb of saying here makes, I said that P is kind of the conventional, thing that's there, and then you have to do something special to get you to that embedded clause being treated as though it's main status, in the same way that you have to sort of do something special to get an embedded implicature in the kinds of cases she talks about in like her 2014 paper. And so I think you can kind of think of it either way, and I'm not totally sure what the difference ends up being. I'm not trying to make kind of a claim that I think makes particularly different predictions than that, I guess.
I think it makes, in the end, it makes a huge difference how we map the conventional meaning onto the scoreboard theory.
Yeah, I mean, I think one big open question about this whole scoreboard domain is kind of how implicatures interact with it. And so, when I'm saying yes, it seems that I'm saying yes to some implicatures, but not all of them. And so which ones are of that sort and how we determine that. Right? So I think that's kind of a whole big set of issues, and I think that this is a specific example of that kind of general issue, I would say. And yeah, so that's, because it's a big problem for everyone, it's not my problem, right? That's the response, I guess, basically. But yeah, I think that that's right, that there's a big question about how do we get from literal meanings to these specific things that actually seem to be what's happening in the conversation and mediate between those with implicatures and with, you could think of this as being a kind of implicature of, well, it doesn't make sense that they would be telling me who said what because our QUD was about this, who stole the cow, and so it must mean that they meant that the embedded content was their main contribution and blah, blah, and think of it as kind of a relevance implicature. But you could also imagine doing, very different things with that kind of case. And I don't have a specific argument about the right way to deal with it. I mean, I think the thing that is clear to me, that like Mandy argues very clearly in that paper, is that the thing that Meyer and Berry say in the 2017 version of their manuscript, which they actually no longer say in a new version that I just discovered, that the X said that P is ambiguous in the semantic sense between eventive and evidential uses, that's not really the right way to think about it, but rather that there's an ambiguity, or there's not an ambiguity, rather there's some kind of pragmatic reasoning or underspecification that gets us these two uses without having to say it's ambiguous between this and that. And so that I would like to think is true, but exactly whether it's underspecification or starting with X said that P being the at-issue content and then reasoning to P being it in a given case, that I don't have any good arguments for either way.
Do we have more questions? Questions someone else asked? You can report them. That's the right marker.
What?
You just have to be able to shoot. Yeah?
No,
So I'm wondering about the scoreboard for the quantitative marker, so page 16. So your proposal was that we introduce hypothetical scoreboard in addition to the actual scoreboard. And I'm wondering why there is no at-issue proposition in the actual scoreboard for the table. I might have missed the point, but I'm wondering why there's no P on the table.
So why there's not a P on the table?
Yeah.
Well, so I'm, in telling this story, reduced beyond that, wasn't trying to make a claim about any facts of the world at all, right? And sort of as we saw in the issue section, the addressee in the actual conversation here says, can't use these normal things that are, we think are, that the system analyzes as being anaphoric to the table, like yes and no, to respond to that. So there definitely can't be anything on the table, because if P was on the table, or if X said that P was on the table, then we would predict, wrongly in this case, that things like yes and no could target that, right? Or that the illocutionary force of different things would be impacting that in that way. So whether there's something in the individual discourse commitments at the actual table, I think that's a little bit less clear. Like clearly there is in some sense in that you can walk away from hearing this story thinking that Venustiano believes that Don Miro said blah, blah, blah. Whether that's kind of a conventional effect of this sentence type, or just sort of a Stalnaker's goat kind of case of like, this is a thing that happened, and so you can figure out that this person might have this belief, but it's not sort of part of what's conventionally encoded semantically, that I think is a little less clear. But for the table part, I think it really is pretty clear that it has to be this way to get these facts right. So that's kind of the purpose of that, I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I just have a curiosity question, because I think for quotatives, the narrative environment does not have to be like a interpersonal dialogue. It could be something that just one person utters, I guess. In those cases, how is this narrative scoreboard going to work? Because you might only have one conversation.
So if I have a character in a story who is giving a monologue with no audience, so I guess I would think that works in the same way that me talking to myself ordinarily would work. And I don't have any specific story about how, me talking to myself devoid of any narrative would work. But if we had a story in which a character was talking to themselves, then, whatever we think in the ordinary, non-narrative, single agent, talking to themselves kind of case ought to carry over to that case. And so I don't have any specific, claims about what we should do about self-directed speech, I guess. But I think that this is, again, a case where whatever the right answer is ordinarily can be ported over to this kind of in-narrative case straightforwardly. I haven't actually encountered any examples that are of this sort, but I don't have any reason to expect that they couldn't exist, I guess. But I mean, I do think that this is something that tends to get used, kind of again like that, so I says blah, blah, blah kind of construction that like really does typically get used when there's like multiple people talking back and forth rapid fire to help kind of keep track of that. And so I guess that in some sense is leveraging the other feature of this quotative, that it does have this limited ability to tell you who the speaker is and who the hearer is, or who the addressee is, and that it's kind of most used in those kinds of cases there where they already know who the players are, and we're just trying to make sure that we know, okay, this one's this person's move, this one's this person's move. And so we might expect that it's a little less likely to find the quotative in the monologue case. But, again, it should be possible from everything I've said. Hopefully it is. It's a good question.
I have one quick question actually that came up in the meeting group, so it's for more people. So in 16, you showed for the Mayan reported mark that you can't have an overt source realized.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, is this somehow definitional? And I remember that for Kadalo Dao, I found that it can have something like according to. So you could realize the source was an according to phrase. Is Mayan the same, or is this a problem, or?
Well, so there's nothing quite analogous to an according to case. So I guess the way to phrase it is that the reportative itself, and I think this is true in Tagalog, but correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't itself license any way of realizing the reporter that wasn't already available otherwise. And so if you had something like an according to phrase that, just like in English would work independent of a reporting thing, the original speaker can then be equated with that person, but it doesn't itself license it. And so that's exactly the same thing here. So when we have these Concord cases like where you use a lexical, verb indicendi, then the reportative can latch onto that and doesn't suddenly create a they say that, he said that, blah, blah, but rather just a he said that, blah, blah.
It can in Tagalog, we get both interpretations.
Well, right, I guess you can always, so I guess the question is whether we really have evidence that there is a separate, distinct third-person interpretation rather than that, that's a special case of a second-person interpretation. Like, I don't know of any cases where you have to get the third-person one, and so then there's a question of, is that just a special way that a second-person one could be true, is that it happens to then be third-person, third-hand rather, or is that really a semantically distinct reading? So I haven't convinced myself, at least, that there's evidence that that's really an ambiguity. But if you have arguments to that effect, I'd be curious to see them. For the Mayan case, like the only case where you can't get the second-hand interpretation is when you have a reportative inside a quotative, right? So John, he said, blah, 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 where blah, blah, blah is a reportative. Then it kind of has to be third hand because the words that he said were, I have the second hand, and so that forces it to be that way. Any other configuration allows for the possibility that it's just second hand.
I mean, it would still not contradict your assumption that it doesn't license a source syntactically or anything. If it was something like they said that they have hearsay evidence, they said that.
Yeah, so it doesn't go, it wouldn't go against that claim. I guess I'm not convinced that that's right anyway. And I guess another way to think about this is that in English where we have no reportative markers, if I say it's raining, in some sense, I wouldn't want to say that's ambiguous between first hand and second hand, right? I could say it's raining when somebody told me and that's how I know, but I don't think there's two different representations, one for first hand and one for second hand. And that seems fairly unlikely for English, and so I guess I'd like to think that the second versus third hand with a reportative in Tagalog or in Maya would be of a similar sort. That could be wrong, but I'm not sure that I know of a good argument against that. What I would regard as the default position that it's the same kind of thing as the first versus second hand under specification in English.
If you had it on a negation, I guess they didn't say that reportative number P. Because they knew that no evidence, reportative evidence, so blue has to be third because it's anchored to them.
Yeah, I'm forgetting, does Tagalog work under negation? I know it works in some embedded environments, but I don't remember if negation is one.
For my speakers it worked, and I think yours that they had some, for their speakers it didn't work, so.
Yeah.
There's some disagreement about
Yeah, I mean, in
general,
the Tagalog reportative is kind of the magical or terrible, depending on your perspective, reportative that does anything that any reportative in any language does. Whereas the Yucatec one is more well-behaved. It kind of does a very clear, coherent set of things and behaves one way and not in these other ways. There's no embedded uses of any